Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. Really excited to have you join us for today's session. We're going to be diving into some of the most common and challenging challenges in volunteerism out there. So looking at recruitment and looking at retention, as well as zooming in on volunteer grants and volunteer time off and how those can be tools in tackling these challenges. Couple super quick housekeeping items up top. You will receive a copy of the recording following the session, so no worries there. And then you'll see there is a chat down below. We'd love to hear where everyone is calling in from, so the organization that you're joining on behalf of, but also feel free to make use of the chat throughout the session with any insights that you have, comments, or questions as well. But without any further ado, we'll kick off some formal intros. My name is Madison, and I'm here on behalf of Double the Donation. We are a workplace giving software platform, so focused on connecting nonprofits with matching gift opportunities, but most relevant for today's conversation, volunteer grants and volunteer time off. I also have the pleasure of working with our platform partners, including today's co-host, Better Impact. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Houston to introduce himself.
Thanks so much, Madison. My name is Houston Goodwin. So I'm the CEO here at Better Impact. I've been in the role for right at a year, and I'm really excited for today. My heart is to help empower volunteer leaders and people who are on the front lines of volunteerism, and certainly see a lot of common struggles that they have, and hopefully we'll be able to cast a wide net and talk about a lot of different things and get a lot of value out of that. Quick background: I've been in software for the last a little over a decade in a lot of different sectors, and really found myself very mission focused, and Better Impact really aligned with that. So really excited to be here on the call, and excited to be helpful as well.
Awesome, and love seeing all the interest come in the chat as well. In terms of the agenda that we have set for today, Houston will be diving into some of these common challenges, looking deeper at why they exist and some of the root issues there. And then we'll take some time to get everyone on the same page with these volunteer grant and volunteer time off programs that we'll be speaking about. And then lastly, we'll go back to those challenges and look at some ways that you can begin tackling recruitment and retention improvement in your organization. So with that, I'll pass it back to Houston for our first section.
Great, thank you so much. Before we get started in the common challenges, and there's a million challenges out there, obviously, and we've kind of narrowed it down to the top four. I wanted to stop for a second and just take a second to zoom out and really talk about the power of volunteerism on the world, because it's quite dramatic. And sometimes if you're in the day-to-day too much, you can lose sight, or it's nice to be reminded every once in a while on a webinar when you have some time on what you are playing a part in. And, I've worked in a lot of sectors, but the impact that this audience is involved with is so massive. A third of the nonprofit workforce is volunteers. What that tells me is, in the nonprofit world, what you are doing and leading these volunteers is mission critical. It's vital. And in 2023 alone, over 5 billion hours of service was done through volunteerism officially, which is over $167 billion of value. And we'll get into this a little bit. It's a lot more than the economic value number, but I just wanted to say that because that's such a big number. I want to give everyone like a pat on the back, because that's bigger than the GDP of some countries. And so what you guys are playing a part in is so special. And what I've seen is, volunteerism is really more than just the value of that labor. It's about volunteers becoming ambassadors and carrying the culture for the mission that you're driving forward. And I love to see that. And one of the things as we get into these challenges that we see is, oftentimes there's this disconnect between the volunteer coordinators and the volunteers and the executive leadership of the organizations. And, maybe that's not you and you don't struggle with that. And if that's the boat you're sitting in, like, congratulations. But, over the last year, I've talked with hundreds of volunteer coordinators and consultants and volunteers in the space. And we've identified 4 common challenges. But really what I want to frame this with is, a lot of these common challenges are simply symptoms of one problem, and that is a lack of strategy and being seen as a strategic part of organizations, which requires strategic leadership. And this certainly isn't the fault of volunteer coordinators that I've met, like not putting in the effort. Most volunteer coordinators are overworked and under-resourced. So what my mission is to really come alongside and help and partner with you through this strategic leadership to see, how do we take some of these common problems and roadblocks that we have in our organizations and look at them through the lens of strategy and strategic leadership rather than just problems that get in our way that need to be like checked off of a list. And so without further ado, let's hop into them. One thing I'll say is this is a half-hour webinar. We could probably spend an hour on each one of these. And so this isn't going to be like super deep on any one subject, but what my hope is to ignite a little thought and perspective on some of these problems to get you thinking. And at the end of this webinar, if you could pick one thing that you could start doing today to improve one part of your journey for volunteers or your department, that would be a huge win. And then at the end, I'll have my email out to everyone as well. So if anyone wants to dive deep on a subject, I love talking about this stuff and would be happy to help. But the first one we want to talk about is the elephant in the room. It's the one that I talk to so many people about, and it's the underinvestment in their volunteer program. And a lot of times, what I have found is that there's an underinvestment because there's really just a lack of data. And what I want to encourage volunteer coordinators and people in charge of leading volunteers is you really need to learn to become a storyteller with your numbers. There's this pool of qualitative versus quantitative data, where quantitative data is the numbers, and that can feel very cold, very harsh, and not really in line with the heart of what we're trying to do in the world of volunteering. And then there's this qualitative data, which are the really cool and amazing stories. And what I would want to encourage is for us to start thinking about how do we pair these together to really share some impactful stories, not only with our executive leaders, but with the fundraising team and our volunteers, because at the end of the day, data is really going to help us not only recruit more volunteers, keep them around longer, help with their retention, get more funding, but help us be seen as that strategic side of our organizations, which is really, really important. Data, one quote that I wrote down that I love is data is how passion gets translated into action at the board level. And so if there are roadblocks in your way, data translated into passion is what is going to help us overcome those roadblocks. And so we're not going to go into some of the solves in this section, but kind of highlighting that. Hopefully I'll try to watch in chat as well, but hopefully some of this resonates with you. And one thing that blows my mind is the second point here. A third of all the workforce in nonprofits is volunteers, but less than a half of a percent of funding goes to the volunteer department. That's a bridge that we have to start working and learning to cross. And the good news is other sectors have seen transformation, both with technology as a catalyst and as well as partnership and professional development. So we really want to concentrate on that because we want to see more funding come in so you and the people on the front lines can get the funding that you deserve to see the impact, push forward in an appropriate way. The second thing that we're going to talk about is volunteer recruitment. One of my favorite sayings is if you aim at nothing, you're going to hit it 100% of the time. And often that is how we treat recruiting because, like I said, we're overworked, we're busy, it's a task to check off. And what we found in surveys is almost less than a quarter of organizations report tracking new volunteer conversion rates. If you don't track it, you're not going to be able to know how to improve it. So we're going to go into how, at the latter part of this webinar, we're going to go in some best practices of how we set this up and be really intentional about recruiting. But I want to really focus on that word intentionality because it's so important. Because 62% of nonprofits in the survey that we're quoting said that recruiting is a big problem for them. And we don't want that to be. We want to be able to connect you with the people in your industry, in your community that want to help, that are aligned with your mission. Formal volunteering is up, that has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. Obviously, we had a big shift go on, and this is a hot topic for a lot of organizations, and we want to come alongside and give you some thoughtful reasons and resources to really help with that. And then the last one we're really going to hit on is retention. I always like to say that volunteers quit experiences much more often than causes. And so you guys have great causes, you have great missions, and we're going to talk about how we really make sure that we're not only initially getting our volunteers to align with our mission, but we're constantly saying the same language. We're saying the same things over and over again and making them feel a part of something bigger to really help you. And again, it all comes down to data and tracking. If you're not tracking your volunteer retention, you don't know what it is. The average volunteer retention rate is somewhere around 65%, which means 1 in 3 volunteers walk out of an organization after 1 year and don't come back. And so we want to talk again about strategically how we can set some things in motion to see that increase, to reduce the burden of recruiting and also increase the impact that you're having. I said the last one, but we do have one more, and that's volunteer expectations. I like to call this engagement, but we really want to be flexible with their volunteers. We want to be thoughtful with the opportunities that we're presenting. We want to be thoughtful on how we're presenting those. And we'll talk a little bit too about skills-based volunteering and the importance of really diving into that. Volunteerism is so much a social connection as well. I think in one of the slides it talked about not only the impact that volunteers have on their community, but the impact that volunteering has on the volunteers. I don't want to understate that. It's so important. What you are doing, the people that are listening to this that are leading volunteers, is so great, both for the community, but also for the volunteers, giving them that sense of purpose. And really, they're looking for that leader to point them and show them how they're plugging into their community, how they're making an impact, and how they're aligning their purpose with the purpose of the organization. That's such a special opportunity that everyone on this call has, and it's worth putting some strategic thought into and giving these volunteers who are giving up their time our best so we can make sure that we have a smooth of transition into making impact as possible. Like I said, all four of these symptoms that we're going to talk about today are really core. They're just symptoms of like one core problem, and a lot of that is a lack of strategy or being seen as strategic value. A lot of times volunteerism is seen as a cost saver, not a force multiplier, when we know that it is. And that's why today it's not just about tips and tricks, it's about reframing volunteerism as a strategic asset. And one of the most powerful ways to do that and underutilized tool and strategy is corporate programs. It's volunteer grants, VTO. And so I'm excited to pass it over to Madison and let her unpack some of these great things that they have going on.
Thanks so much, Houston. Yes, we are going to be talking about volunteer grants and volunteer time off as two potential tools in your volunteer management toolkit when it comes to addressing these recruitment and retention challenges. So first and foremost, a lot of you on this call, you might be familiar with volunteer grants and volunteer time off. Some of you may be newer to these corporate programs, but whatever your level of familiarity with volunteer grants and volunteer time off is specifically, I'm sure folks on the call are all familiar that companies are more and more looking to get involved in volunteering. And why is that the case? I mean, exactly to Houston's point, volunteerism has a huge impact on the people who are doing the volunteering. So we know it's good for your mental health. We know it's good for being more purposeful in your daily life. And that ties in with being engaged at work as well. So that's something that businesses have realized, that when their employees are volunteering, there are all these kind of ripple effect benefits that come back in return. And so that's something they're looking to encourage employees to get more and more involved in. I think when we talk about employee volunteering, it's easy to kind of picture a company-wide volunteer day, but I want to be clear that when we're talking about volunteer grants and volunteer time off, these are actually programs that are structured in a way to allow individual volunteers the flexibility to choose which causes they're volunteering for, when they're doing the volunteering, and what exactly that engagement looks like. So volunteer time off, I think folks are pretty familiar with this one, but these are paid time off hours that are set aside specifically for volunteering. So making sure that employees have a chance to step away from their desk and be involved in the causes that they care about. Now, volunteer grants actually have this financial component to them. So you might see a couple different names for these programs: Dollars for Doers, Volunteer Time Match. We're going to be calling them volunteer grants, but really what we're referring to is a program that is structured in a way where a company will make a financial donation to the organization that their employee volunteers with. So that might look like me, Madison, just showing up as an individual volunteer for my local animal shelter. And because I work for a company with one of these programs, so that could be Verizon, that could be Google, that could be CBS. But because I work for a company with a volunteer grant program, my employer will actually make a donation after I complete that volunteer time. So understanding these programs, what is the tie-in when it comes to recruitment and retention specifically, and how can organizations make the most of these programs? I think let's look at the recruitment side of things first, and volunteer time off specifically. Knowing that recruitment can be a challenge, what are the common issues that volunteers cite as barriers to getting involved? Over and over again, it's often lack of time, and not just lack of time, but also work commitments specifically come up as a reason that people feel they don't have time to volunteer. If you're here in the US, then, looking at one of the most common demographics doing volunteering, ages 35 to 44 are a really highly engaged group. And chances are a lot of those, the members of those groups, they're working as well. So all that to say, volunteers are busy, and volunteer time off can be a powerful tool for lowering that barrier to entry and opening up time to volunteer. Now, when we want to talk about how you can use volunteer time off in your recruitment efforts, I think the first step is really making sure that this is something that your prospective volunteers and even current volunteers are aware of. We've seen that 65% of Fortune 500 companies are offering volunteer time off, but not every employee working for a company with this program is even aware that they have these hours. So step one, highlighting that widespread availability and making sure that volunteer time off is something you're speaking to when you're looking to recruit volunteers. I also like to mention that anytime you can be more specific and point to social proof points, that can be a really powerful way to drive action. So what I mean by that is, including some examples of local companies that do offer these volunteer time off programs, or even if you have volunteers who are using volunteer time off hours with their permission, of course, spotlighting how they're using that time to be involved as a volunteer. And then also looking at some of your lapsed volunteers who maybe it's been a little while since they've spent time with your organization. Key times of year that relate to volunteer time off can be a nice way to send a nudge and encourage them to get back involved. So like with other PTO programs, depending on the way they're structured, people might have a certain amount of time to use their volunteer time off hours. So that could be something that resets on a yearly basis. And with that in mind, then using that as a timely nudge to say, hey, it's been a while since we've seen you, or maybe you've never volunteered with us before, but it's about that time of year when you might want to start thinking about using your VTO hours. Now shifting gears to look at volunteer grants and look at the retention side of things. There are really two pieces here that I think speak to the retention value of volunteer grants. And the first is how volunteer grants can actually deepen that ROI per volunteer hour. Earlier, we had that stat about the $34 value of a volunteer hour. So each volunteer hour being estimated to be worth $34. But when you have a volunteer who then is able to claim a volunteer grant, that could be an additional $8 per hour, $15 per hour, $25 per hour, whatever that may be. All of a sudden, now you've deepened the impact of that volunteer time. And that can be really powerful in speaking with different stakeholders at your organization. So I know Houston, that's something that he brought up earlier, talking about the underinvestment in volunteerism and having these quantifiable data points to be able to really speak to the strategic value of volunteering. So that can go a long way internally in making the case for volunteerism. But not just that, it's also the fact that, your volunteers, they're your supporters, and they want to know that their time is having an impact. So being able to communicate, not only did you help us through your time and your effort and your skills, but then you were able to take that a step further, get a financial donation from your employer. And with that funding, we were able to, do X, Y, and Z in terms of what that meant for the mission. Now, the other side of things is that volunteer loyalty, deepening commitment, and encouraging consistency from your volunteers. I've talked about how programs are often structured in a dollars per hour way, but some companies also structure their programs around particular volunteer milestones. So common milestones might be 10 volunteer hours, 25 volunteer hours, 50 volunteer hours, and then after the volunteer reaches that given milestone is when they can go about claiming the grant. So when that's the case, it can be, again, a powerful nudge to be able to say, hey, it looks like you've spent 5 hours with us recently. You might be eligible for a volunteer grant. You should look into your company program, and maybe that 10-hour mark is what will put you over the top into being able to claim that grant. So now that we have taken a look at those programs and how volunteer grants and volunteer time off are structured, Houston will zoom us back out in looking at the recruitment and retention strategy and sharing some tips for addressing those problems.
Thanks, Madison. So let's start with recruiting. I like to say recruiting with intention because what we have found in surveying nonprofit organizations is less than 1 in 5 nonprofit organizations actually create a persona for their volunteers before they go off recruiting. So in a lot of cases, what they're trying to do is cast a very wide net and get as many people as possible because that seems like it would be the at surface level the easiest way to get more volunteers. But then we run into retention issues if we're not aligned, as Madison pointed out, that deep connection. And so I always like to say our organization might be for anyone, but it's not for everyone. Because there are certain things that you're going to be looking for, whether it's the time you need volunteers, and if you have someone that is working a banking hours job, they're not going to be a good fit. A lot of people are very mission driven. So you want to find volunteers that not only are willing to give their time and available, but also are really behind the specific mission of your organization. And that's really important to do that work up front because what that's going to do is that's going to give you an easier time as you continue to go down the path of getting them involved, engaged, retained, and then creating really advocates for your program. And that's really what I want us to look at volunteer recruiting as is we're not only recruiting volunteers to do the work, we're recruiting advocates for our cause. And this could be for helping recruit more volunteers, to get more opportunities, to get more funding, to prove that ROI. And the more advocates you can have on your team, the better you're going to be at creating that impact. And so, one of the first steps and a tangible takeaway that we can take from this short webinar is creating what we're calling an ideal volunteer profile. So this is a very common tactic in other companies and other sectors. Usually it's called an ideal customer profile, and we've adapted it. So I believe they're dropping it in the chat, but we actually have a quick handout on how to create an IVP. I mean, it's going to ask basic questions like, who is your ideal volunteer? What's their skills? What's their age? What's their motivations? And then it's going to let you hone your messaging to make sure that you're doing the best job at going to where they are to find them. And so I was talking to one volunteer coordinator a few weeks ago who used to put this tent up at a farmer's market to recruit volunteers. And then through data and tracking and creating an IVP, they realized that their ideal volunteer wasn't coming from this. And actually, they weren't getting very many meaningful volunteers from this. And it was a big lift to carry the tent out, set it up, and sit someone out on a Saturday at the farmer's market. And they found social media to be a much more effective way to recruit the target audience that they had. So again, this is about putting strategy in. In that PDF, there's a link to a blog that I wrote recently on how to recruit with intention that goes a little more in depth with some best tips and strategies. But another thing, and this came up with Madison, is consider where your ideal volunteer might work. Are there opportunities to engage with their company? Someone mentioned in the chat, I'm trying to keep up, but about how do we get people and the leaders of the company involved? And again, I hate to be saying the same thing over and over, but data is really helpful for that. Companies want to know that they're making a real impact. And that's going to be very helpful the more data that we have to provide them. And so we really want to put a lot of thought in recruiting with intention to make sure not only we're recruiting enough people for the cause, but we're recruiting the right people for the cause. We're meeting them where they are, and we're reducing those barriers. Reducing those barriers is exactly what this talks about is we want to make it as easy as possible to volunteer. So this could be things like leveraging technology, leveraging consistent schedules, making micro volunteer opportunities, having virtual volunteering or virtual onboarding rather than in-person, skills-based engagements. We're finding a lot of specifically millennials, Gen Z, really attracted to skills-based volunteering because again, they want to connect and find that purpose. And so again, similar to what Madison was talking about, consider targeting employees of particular industries at companies. Like if you need help with your accounting, there are accountants that would love to feel like they're creating value for something important that are looking at spreadsheets all day. I can promise you that. So go find some accountants. If you're looking for help with recruiting, go find someone that's really good at sales or talking to people or an extrovert, and maybe think through where do those people work, where do they hang out, how do they communicate, and how can I find them where they are? Because removing those barriers is going to be a huge lift for your organization. And if you're not sure what the barriers are, ask your volunteers. Ask your volunteers that love you and want to see you succeed and are on your team. Ask them what's hard. And they're going to tell you if you ask them in the right way, like this part of the process is very complex, or the onboarding was very burdensome, or the communication is inconsistent, or we never start on time, or we always go over. And see how you can start working to remove some of those barriers and communicate to your volunteers and to prospective volunteers the efforts that you're making in that. And then aligning volunteers' expectations with the experience. Happiness is the shared realization of expectations. And so what we want to do is we want to set out, here's what we're looking to accomplish. And then we're going to share that realization together and we're all going to be happy about it. So that means clearly defined roles and tasks. Offer a variety of options correlated with different motivations, different goals. So some people are way more social and they want to volunteer and meet and talk to people. And some people just want to sit in the back of the room and do an independent task to feel like they're making a big difference, but they're not necessarily really excited about talking to a bunch of people and meeting strangers. So make sure that we have roles for both, right? Because both are very needed. And we don't want an extrovert to be in the back of the warehouse sorting clothes and an introvert at the front greeting people, right? We want to make sure that they have the opportunity to volunteer where they feel like they can make the biggest impact. And again, ensure role descriptions are accurate and clear. This is really big. Like you don't want to show up for a volunteering, slot on the schedule and then feel like you got the rug pulled out from under you. Obviously, things come up, but if things come up, just clearly communicate that. Hey, I know you volunteered for this. Here's where we need you because of X, Y, and Z that came up. Would you be willing to do that? So just set those expectations and make sure that there's clarity around it so people know what they're signing up for. Then we'll talk about retention. Someone asked on the questions I was trying to keep up, like what's the best way to calculate retention? There's a lot of ways we can go into in-depth, but the simplest way for the time that we have here is you look at a cohort of volunteers. So let's say you started the year with 100 volunteers. A year later, you look at that same list of volunteers and see how many are there, and you just divide. So if you had 100 at the start of the year, and then 1 year later, 70 of those are still volunteering actively with your organization, you have a 70% retention rate. If it's 50, it's 50-50. There are a lot of more nuanced ways to do it, but in broad strokes, that's going to be a big one. But what I want to encourage volunteer coordinators from that strategic leadership perspective is retention isn't just about preventing people from leaving. It's about giving people a reason to stay. Right? These are people that are volunteering their time and they want to find a deep purpose. And one of your roles as the strategic leader of this core part of your organization, like I said, that is a third of the whole workforce of nonprofits, is to give them that reason to stay. Is to give them those early wins so that at the end of a shift, they say, if someone asks, was it worth your time? They have a very easy yes. Right. So we want to look for those wins. And it's really important at the beginning, right? Like if you have, some organizations have more burdensome onboarding with background checks and trainings, and it's a high bar to get in. And maybe that's out of necessity and that's okay. But we want to be looking at how can we get really fast wins? How can we plug them in and communicate the impact we're having as a group? It's one of the reasons why I started this webinar out saying, hey, there's 5 billion hours done in 2023. No one person contributed a significant percentage to that, but we're all part of something larger. And that's really good to be reminded of. Treat our volunteers the same way with data. You may have done X amount of hours or X amount of impact, but as a whole, this is what we were able to do, and we couldn't have done it without you. Make sure that they have that reason to stay and they feel like they're part of the mission. And that's going to overcome a lot of scheduling issues, right? Sometimes scheduling issues are real. Sometimes scheduling issues are, I don't want to be rude and say that I just don't feel like I'm making an impact. And so what's going to make people go out of their way and move their schedule and stick to their commitments is really feeling like they're part of something bigger. And one of your jobs as a volunteer coordinator is to present that in a way that is clear and effective for retention. And then lastly is encouraging investment. This is where it's outside of a lot of volunteer coordinators that I've spoken with personally's comfort zone. But what I tell them is finance is spoken in dollars, fundraising is spoken in campaigns. So volunteering has to be spoken in the language of impact. That means the qualitative and quantitative data coming together. We need to translate volunteer outcomes into strategic outcomes for the organization. This is going to help encourage investment. Working with companies like Double Nation is a great way as well to prove that ROI and create real. Every volunteer we get equals this amount of fundraising, equals this amount of VTO or corporate sponsorship. These are things that you already have done most of the hard work in many cases, and it's just about creating the language to stop that barrier. This is something personally that I am super passionate about, and I've met with dozens of executive leadership boards alongside the volunteer coordinators to help bridge that gap. And we've seen a lot of great success of seeing budgets increase, seeing resources given. So if there's anything that I can do to be helpful with that, feel free to reach out and ping me directly. Because what I want to say kind of as we're closing and we're at the end of this is if you're struggling with recruitment, if you're struggling with retention, if you're struggling with even making the case for more resources, it's not because you're not doing a good job. It's not because you failed. In most cases, it's because you've been expected to deliver results without data, investment, or strategic tools, which is like table stakes for every other industry that I've been a part of. So I want to give you the tools and the resources to have the voice to go ask for what you need to do your job well, because what you're doing is so important to your organizations. And that's why I'm excited to be here. That's why I'm excited to be in this industry. I appreciate all of the warm welcomes I've had over the last year. And, that's our mission at Better Impact, is to give those tools and insights and see volunteer strategies transformed. And so last thing I'm going to do with several hundred people live is give my personal email. If every one of you email me, it's going to take me a long time to respond, but if I can do anything, if you want to dive deeper, if you need links to things we've sent, feel free to reach out. We also have a landing page I think we've sent with a volunteer strategies guide on it. But yeah, super excited. Thank you, Madison, so much. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Houston. Excited to see those emails rolling in, I'm sure. And also love in the chat the way that people are sharing different survey links and expertise that they've gathered from their experience. That's been super awesome to see come through. So really just like one final promo here at the end. If you're interested in hearing more about workplace volunteering and workplace fundraising, we will be having a free virtual summit in October. We'll be chatting more about volunteer grants and volunteer time off. So would love to see some familiar names at that session. But otherwise, I think most of the questions that we had come through in the chat got answered in some way, shape, or form. So really, I see someone asking for the email. We'll go back to that. We'll leave on that note. But Houston, any other closing thoughts before we wrap up today's session?
No, this was fantastic. Like this is deep wells of knowledge and things we could go in, and there's only so much we can cover in 30 minutes. But hopefully, if nothing else, the takeaway should be what's one thing that I can walk out, whether it's surveying people, creating that IVP, giving people a reason to stay or that quick one immediately. But just try to pick one thing and see what you can take action on this week while it's fresh on your brain. And that's at least a step in the right direction.
Okay, thank you all so much and hope to see you at a future session.